First off, my name is Miles Berghoff. Everybody knows me as Sonar in the fishing world. I'm a tournament fisherman as well, primarily bass fisherman. So I'm not going to be able to chime in on any of the crappie stuff during this presentation. I'm just co-hosting, kind of technical support and things like that. I host a fishing show called Sweetwater, and am also a Navionics pro staff. So that's why I'm helping Tommy out here. So the presentation tonight, as you guys well know, is catching more crappie with pro angler Tommy Skarlis, presented by Bass Pro Shops. And you know, this is a really cool presentation. This is something that I'm actually really excited to hear a lot about, because I don't know a ton about targeting a crappie specifically, and he's gonna go all over the ins and outs of using mapping technology to be able to pinpoint these fish. And Tommy really breaks the mold. He's a touring walleye and crappie fisherman. He's been a professional for many years, but he doesn't just walleye and crappie fish. He catches bass. I mean, Tommy, you do just about everything, don't you?
I love to catch just about everything that swims.
Right on. And walks too, and flies, because it says right here that you do a lot of hunting as well.
Yeah, if you know, I always joke. I always say that I fish so I can afford to hunt.
That's how a lot of people do it, and that's awesome. So you're just an overall outdoorsman, sportsman. That's awesome. You're a native to Iowa, which is awesome. I have a few good friends in Iowa. You began fishing at age 3. I mean, that's probably a pretty common thing amongst all of us outdoorsmen. You know, starting real early, that's real important. And you hone your skills in the Mississippi River, along with small lakes, farm ponds, expensive reservoirs, all throughout the Midwest. And it looks like you started off tournament fishing in 1991. Tell me a little bit about starting out as a tournament angler.
Well, you know, it was pretty interesting. We had fished some Mariner Spring Classics and some other stuff that was going on at the time. And at one of those events, I ended up meeting Al Linder, Babe Winkleman, Gary Roach, to name a few. And ever since then, I was bit by the bug. I've been very blessed in my career to have won probably more major titles than any other walleye angler, and leading money winner, et cetera. But where I've really gotten excited lately is crappie. And we went down in 2013, won the Crappie Masters National Championship. And after that, it just blew up from there. You know, when people say the learning curve is flattened, I don't believe that at all. With crappie, it just keeps exploding. And I keep learning more and more every time I go out. I'm so fired up this year about crappie that it's hard sometimes to focus on walleye.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I've got into crappie fishing a little bit recently, and one thing I've learned is that it is extremely popular right now, and so that's awesome. Congrats on all your successes there. And you were the Cabela's MWC World Walleye Champion this year, 2017.
Yep, just this last season.
Awesome, man. Well, that is great. And so let's get started with your presentation. Again, this is presented by Bass Pro Shops and as well as Navionics. So I'm going to let you take it home, and I'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Miles. All right, well, it looks like we've got everything up and rolling. And this seminar is catching more crappies. Of course, I'm Tommy Skarlis. And right now, I don't know about the rest of you guys or girls that are out there watching this seminar, but we are definitely gripped in the throes of the cold weather here in the upper Midwest. And while a lot of my friends are dreaming about crappie fishing through the ice, which I'm going to do a little bit of that when I get back from my next road stint, it's time to head south. And when I say time to head south, I hear they're biting in Florida. This is kind of what started all this Crappie Madness was the National Classic or the National Championship back in 2013. And you can see that on the left there where my partner Kyle and I ended up winning that championship. But we've also done pretty good down in the Florida events. We fished 2 events down there, finished second both times, and we're working on the Crappie Masters National Championship. In fact, I'm just leaving here in a couple, 3 days to head down south and going to compete in the Crappie Masters tournaments, both there in Central Florida. I can't remember the name of the body of water right now. And then we're also going to go up to Talquin Lake or Lake Talquin and tear them up there. But, if you want to learn more about crappie fishing, either catching a tournament by fishing one of them, or even just showing up to the weigh-ins, to the rules meetings, they're awesome events, awesome forums. And the interesting thing about it is that I thought the walleye angler was very gregarious, would talk a lot. You get into these crappie events and these anglers usually seem to spill it all, talk about what they're doing, if you fish them or not. It's a great venue in order to catch this kind of stuff. This is the Crappie Masters tournament schedule. As you can see, they go to Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, Illinois, Alabama, you name it. They're all over the map, and a lot of really cool events. They've also got Crappie Masters Television, which is on the Pursuit channel, and you can find them here at like DirecTV at channel 604, Dish 393, Verizon, CenturyLink, and Roku. But what I found interesting about the Crappie Masters is not only have I learned a lot from the other anglers, I've also gotten to be friends with the staff. They're very knowledgeable. And what's going to roll this seminar out is a question that I've been asked quite a number of times from Mike Vallentine. He always says, I don't care about your spots, or I don't care about your jig color. What I want to know more about is what's your pattern? And, Mike being the host of the Crappie Masters, oftentimes films us while we're out there, has us stay around to film television shows and stuff. But this is the key question. What's your pattern? And this seminar is going to get out. It's going to start out a little bit technical. Some of you may think it's a little boring. Hold on with me, because this is going to answer a question that I get asked more often than not, is how do you break down a new body of water? How do you locate fish? How do you find fish? And, invariably, how do you locate crappie? First of all, we're going to start out at what depth are they at? You can solve a lot of the crappie puzzle by figuring out what depth they're at. And if we look at this map here, if somebody said they were fishing in 5 to 7 foot of water, look how much this lake, how much water would actually be eliminated. You'd already eliminate the deep water channel. You'd already eliminate all of this water right here. And you'd start getting into, say, this band of water right over here on the left, 5 to 7 foot of water. You could also eliminate all of the shallows. So finding the hot depth, finding what body of water, or what depth of water those fish are biting at on any given time on that body of water is a huge key to cracking the pattern. You talk to an angler at the cleaning station, boat ramp, somebody that just got off the water and was successful. Maybe you might chat with them online here a couple, 3 days afterwards. You say, man, I don't care about your jig color, your lure. I'm not going to bother you about where you were at, but how deep were you fishing? And it's amazing how a lot of anglers will let their guard down and tell you how deep they were fishing. Now, if they say 7 foot of water, you might want to focus on 5 to 9 foot of water, because everybody's transducer is different. And oftentimes if the fish move, it may not be a big move. It may be 1 or 2 foot deeper or shallower, but find out that hot depth and you're going to locate a lot more crappies. What structure are they relating to? Are they on brush piles? Are they on sharp breaks? Locating that structure and figuring out what kind of structure they're relating to is vital. Oftentimes when I catch a couple of fish, I'm going to start looking at what type of structure I'm on. I'm going to store a couple of coordinates, and I'm going to say, okay, I caught a fish here. We look at this right here. This is a saddle. So when I start looking at the map and I want to duplicate that pattern, I can find other saddles. We can look here and find a saddle, up here at the top and find a saddle. All these spots that I've somewhat circled with my cursor, these are all saddles. As you can tell here on a saddle, you've got deep water feeding up onto that saddle. You've got deep water coming from the other side, or deeper water. And here, as you can see by the contour lines, we've got that saddle in between two shallower bottom contents, or two shallower spots on the lake. So, identify, are they on saddles? Are they on humps? We start to look at this. Of course, right by this saddle we were just looking at, here's a major hump. Oftentimes I say if you look at a hump, they look like fried eggs. Here's the yolk of the egg, here's the white of the egg, and so on and so forth. But as you can see, there's numerous humps here, and if you want to start looking on this map, you can start noticing other humps as you start looking at this map. Now we're breaking down the pattern. All of a sudden, if I'm fishing this hump and I go here and I catch fish, and I go here and I catch fish, oftentimes finding humps that top out or humps that are the same depth, the same makeup, that's going to be a big part of the pattern. So find out if they're on humps, and in turn, duplicate and find more spots. Now, another thing I'm going to do when I'm using this pattern location is I'm going to use it to get away from the crowds. If I'm fishing this hump right here and there's a big crowd fishing it, get away from the crowd. Go to the opposite side of the lake, or make maybe a 1 mile or a 2 mile move, and boom, you could have a hump all to yourself loaded with fish. So it's another way to not only find more fish, but it's also going to find fish away from the crowd. Here's another defining piece of the puzzle. Putting something else together with not just humps, but let's say humps near a channel. Here we're going to look over here. We've got the channel coming down, flowing through this reservoir. Now, if you might have noticed, I've chosen Lake Talquin. That's one of the bodies we're going to be going to next on the Crappie Masters. And I ramped it up. I was doing homework, and I thought, well, this would be a great body of water. Start familiarizing myself with it by pointing out these structural elements, you guys and girls. And then that way I'm doing my homework while we're working here. So humps near a channel. Got that channel coming down here like this. I've got a hump here, 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 so on and so forth. So just putting together one piece of the puzzle at a time. Another structural element that I pay attention to is sometimes outside bends in the channels or turns. They're even called channel swings. There's a lot of different names for them. But you take this bend in the channel, you come here, you got this bend, so your outside bends. Oftentimes, wherever you find an outside bend, you're going to find a harder bottom content. That's the reason that channel bent there. It was coming down like this, it hit harder bottom, and it broke this way. Now, I got a little ahead of myself there, but you can find other channels or other areas. Here's another channel right here. Here's an outside bend. Here's an outside bend, so on and so forth. If we can notice here, here's where another channel comes in. And that, in turn, is going to show you these channel swings or these outside bends. And again, that's where there's a harder bottom content. That's where that river was going along, and it would hit that harder bottom and then break off and formulate this. Another thing you're going to see too is you're going to see where there's an oxbow lake. And that was formed where that channel actually sooner or later broke through and then kept going this way. So paying attention to oxbows, and then also in those oxbows, wherever there's a bend, there's going to be deeper water. There's going to be a channel swing or a turn. Pay attention to that. That makes a big difference too. Inside bends, sometimes called points. If you can see where these arrows are pointing, there's an inside bend right there. Here's the outside bend. Here's the inside bend. And that's a point that's formed there. So every time you see an inside bend or an inside turn, their point is going to be located there. So if all of a sudden you start seeing fish on these inside bends or these points, now you've got another piece of the pattern, and you can start duplicating that by finding other points and other inside bends on the other channels in that reservoir. Secondary channels, we talked about that earlier, but here is a secondary channel coming down here like this. Here could be, let's say, a crick arm. This might have been the secondary channel caused by that crick arm coming down here like this. A lot of these areas start to get silted in over time, but a lot of them stay clean as well. So here you can see this secondary channel coming down here. Here's a crick arm. Here's a secondary channel coming in here like this, where those secondary channels meet primary channels. Those oftentimes, I call those fish intersections, and those are great places to look, especially, again, if you found success in an area previously. Flats, another great fish holding piece of structure. Here, right here is a flat. Here's a flat. Any place where these contour lines, instead of being quickly going down from 1 foot down to 7 foot, now all of a sudden your next contour line is at 8 foot, your next one's at 9 foot, and so on and so forth. Here's an area where you see the lines that are spread out or farther apart. Those are flats. Here's a flat. Even these up here in this crick arm, down in the lower right corner, those could be considered flats because, again, they're tapering areas. Here are drop-offs or sharp breaks. Anytime that you see the lines get dark, in other words, your contour lines on your cartography, any place those start to get dark, that means that they're starting to stack up on your map. And in turn, those are sharp breaks or drop-offs. Each time I go out on a body of water, that's one of the things I want to key on is, are they on sharp breaks or are they on flats? And again, that's another question I always ask to try to break down a body of water, find these structural elements. Now, I didn't shade in or I didn't mark every sharp break on this map. So I wanted to leave a little bit of opportunity here for you to look at this map and start saying, okay, I see what he's talking about. Over here's a sharp break from where the shallows start up here and then quickly break off into deeper water. Here's maybe a slower tapering break where the lines are farther apart. Here's a sharp break. And you could do a little bit of that yourself and learn from that. Now, you could take this and go onto your own lake map. And a lot of this stuff will start jumping out in living color whenever you see this. You know, it's cool too about Navionics web app. If we look at this, there's some pins or some markers that are placed on every Navionics map. And if you highlight those or you put your cursor on there and click on that, oftentimes a little question mark will come up and you can hit that and you can see what it is. You can see that it's a hump near the channel. It'll show you about how deep that depth contour is there. It'll tell you the county you're in, the state that you're in, and the depth area that you're in. These little pins are awesome. I was looking through this and one of them said it had a marker. It said brush pile. So that was really cool where somebody had actually, on that community layer, that SonarChart, they had actually put down a brush pile that they had located. So with pins and markers, doing your homework at home, you can figure this out and put a lot of this together yourself. Now let's start adding this up. What if you found a brush pile, added that up with a hump, found out that there was a channel there, a nearby flat, secondary channel junction, plus a southerly wind? We're putting together all the keys to the pattern. And this, once you start to really define a pattern like this, we're going to find brush piles on humps, near the channel, nearby flat, secondary channel coming in, southerly wind. Here it is. Here's some brush piles. They're on humps. They've got a channel coming by here. There's a nearby flat, which is right here. There's a secondary channel, which is coming, flowing in right here. And then you've got a southerly wind, which oftentimes this would be a great place to crappie fish because that southerly wind, you'd be somewhat protected by an offshore wind. That's another area where I found that a web app is invaluable, is I can figure out, say like, oh, okay, I've been catching them on a certain pattern. And the next day, the wind's going to be out of a certain direction. It's going to be honking. Let's say it's going to be out of the west. Well, this spot that I was fishing at over here is going to be fried because with this heavy wind coming in there, and it's amazing how heavy winds really seem to affect crappies. I don't know so much if it drives them out of there, if it drives the bait out of there. That could be some of the reasons I figured out why they're not there. Another reason is if you're spider rigging or you're jigging, they like the bait held still a lot of the times. And when the boat's rocking up and down or bouncing back and forth, you name it, or rocking back and forth or bouncing up and down, those fish aren't going to be there or aren't going to be as easy to catch as if you can find some of these spots where they're a little bit protected from the wind. So again, with a strong west wind, I'm going to look at this map and I'm going to start keying in on spots that are out of the wind, spots where I can duplicate the pattern anywhere where you've got a west wind. And I've put all 4 wind directions here. Here's a north wind. Here would be some areas that were protected from a north wind. Here's a south wind, so on and so forth. So getting out of that wind helps you to catch a few more crappies. Also helps if you've got a smaller boat and you don't really want to stand there and fish in the wind. It also helps if you're standing on the bank. So using that web app I found is invaluable to do the homework, and then having the best mapping possible when you're fishing, having as many maps available to you as possible always helps you put that together and build your pattern and find more fish. Don't have a map on your area or body of water? That's where SonarChart has become so invaluable to me that I can actually go out and I can use SonarChart that comes with Navionics cartography, that you can actually see areas where other people have improved the map or the community has got together and improved that body of water. It's incredible the amount of body of water just guys like myself and other Navionics pro staffers have done, or you like Miles, he's done a lot of sonar charting. He can attest to that. You get outside of that, and not only have pro staffers done that, but you, the angler, the community, you've gotten out there and you've done sonar chart. Right now, when I'm at a tournament, and maybe the map might be weak, there's some areas where we've gone to where there's areas that are non-existent with some mapping. We can actually sonar chart live and put together that map and put together those structural elements while we pre-fish. And all I do is simply turn the unit on and I start fishing. If I'm going to fish that area in the tournament, I'll really super define it and I'll go across it with SonarChart Live, update my map or my cartography in my unit. If you've got an iPad, which is what you see here, that can Wi-Fi up to most units. And in turn is you can basically use your iPad in order to make it an extension of your graph or your sonar unit and really beef things up and really improve what you're doing. Now, we're looking for fish. We're trying to find fish. You know, you could go out and you could dip timber, you could jig, you could throw slip floats around. What I usually do when I'm breaking down a body of water and I'm starting to put together those patterns, or I'm trying to figure out a pattern and find fish, is I'm going to start trolling. I mean, basically you can cover a lot of water. You could put your lures in front of more fish. So trolling really makes a big difference. My personal best came trolling, and I've won a lot of titles trolling. Not all of them, but you know, it's amazing how trolling can really find a lot of big fish as well. Now, trolling can be done slow trolling or tight line trolling, like spider rigging. As you can see here, you've got a great big swath that you're covering. You've got, say, 16-foot rods out, which could basically take your area here and really make it big. Then when you get into, say, open water areas to where you put out planer boards and flat lines. Oftentimes we'll run flat lines and planer boards in conjunction with each other. It's amazing sometimes how they're going to find those planer boards, the presentations behind them more attractive, or they find flat lines more attractive. So doing the 2-and-2 approach, where you put out 2 planer boards and 2 flat lines on each side of the boat, or going 3-and-1, vice versa, you know, you can spread out applications or spread out these presentations and really cover a lot of water. The best way I can put it to you is when you start putting planer boards in use, it's like turning a 2-row picker into a great big combine. And as you can see here, we've got the jet trails coming off of some of these planer boards. I've actually got a 3-in-1 presentation here where we've got 1, 2, 3 planer boards out there. You can really, really cover a big swath of water. Got to be a little careful. Oftentimes, a lot of boaters, a lot of anglers don't even know what planer boards are. So if you see a boat coming or you see an angler getting close to you, you might want to burn everything in real quick, get it out of their way. But I'm not going to get into a lot of planer board fishing in this seminar. I'm going to touch it lightly, but we've got the archives to where we've done both trolling jigs for crappie. That was February 2016. I just went back and referenced those seminars so that I could see what I was going to do in this seminar. It's a great reference for trolling planer boards and crankbaits, which was the other one that I'd put together for Navionics in the webinars. That was held back May of 2015. And again, here's the link. It's also easy to go back. Just go to the archives on Navionics webpage, go to May of 2015, and you can find the trolling planer boards for crappies there as well. Another great source of reference that I've been able to contribute to and also have used for a lot of my crappie education is different publications, In-Fisherman being one of those. The planer boards and jigs program that I'll be using here fairly shortly down in Florida. That was in the In-Fisherman March-April edition. And here's a great illustration of a planer board going down to an inline diving device, which is an offshore tadpole. And then in turn, as you've got line going back to some jigs here. So the planer board, how it works, it clips to the line. This line goes up to the rod or to the boat. And then in turn, as that line goes back to this clip here, which goes back to the presentation. The more line you let out, the farther the planer board takes your presentation from the boat, and the more successful you're going to be. Now, with tadpoles, this kind of gives you an idea what the tadpole looks like. You put this in the water, and this clip sooner or later gets up here in this top position, and it allows that tadpole to dive down into the water. And the dive curves that you can use will show you at certain speeds how much line to let out. Pay great attention to this 1 mile an hour line right here. What we found out is that 1 mile an hour is a tremendously effective trolling speed in a lot of different applications. Now, sometimes they want it as slow as 0.3 to 0.5 miles per hour. Other times they want it up to 1.5. Caught them on crankbaits, crappies on crankbaits going 2, 2.5. My partner Mike Baker loves going fast, covers more water when he's trolling. But when you're doing your thing with crappies, you're trolling, 1 mile an hour is a great speed to both focus at and start at. So don't be afraid to pay attention to 1 mile an hour. All right. This depth curve is going to tell you how much line to let out to get your lures down to a certain depth when you're using these tadpoles. What I like to think oftentimes is it's almost at 1 mile an hour, almost 2 to 1. So if you let out, say, 2 foot of line, it'll go down 4 feet. But we look at 1 mile an hour, trolling with a tadpole. Let's say we want to get that bait down 10 foot. We'll come down here to 10 foot. We'll slide over here to this line right here. And in turn, 10 foot down, puts that lure about 12, maybe 15 foot back. You can see here if I want to put down a lure 20 foot down, come down here, I'm going to want to put out about 30 foot of line. So in any event, these dive curves are invaluable to figuring out how far down you want to put your lure. That's how many feet back. It also gives you an opportunity to duplicate. Let's say that you're catching fish on crankbaits 10 foot down, and you want to put a jig or a fly or just a plain minnow down. And this is a great device to use to do that. These dive curves allow you to do that and allow you to control how much line you let out. It gives you an opportunity so you don't have to guess. It's incredible how many anglers I've talked to in crappie fishing that have no idea where their lures are at. Now, that's not a bad thing. If you set out a crankbait, say, I don't care if it's a bandit, you set out 50 foot of line in a bandit crankbait or 50 foot of line in a flicker shad, and you catch fish, set it out 50 foot again. You put a 300 bandit out 20 foot, catch fish on it, want to try another bandit that same color, that's a great thing to do, is to duplicate that process. And that's really what trolling for crappies or any other species really is it's duplicating that process. It's putting on a lure, catching a fish on it, and doing it again. I've had a couple of people I've been fishing with. We catch a fish on, say, like one of these crawdad colored flicker shads. They want to take it off and put a different lure on. I'm like, dude, that is not the line. That is not the rod you want to play with. Leave that one out. Bring a different one in and put a different colored crankbait on that line. And, you know, keep moving, keep changing things, but don't change the one that was catching fish. That's a great one to always leave in the water, especially for the rest of the day. Now, we're talking about planer boards, brand new board that we just finally got out on the market. I mean, this took a long time with testing and also trying to figure out how to manufacture it. It's finally out, and it's the awesome Crappie planer board. If you look at this board is similar to the OR34 that Offshore used to make. Now it's got a float on top of it. And Offshore didn't say, well, too bad if you bought an OR34, you know, get rid of it. Now you want to buy the OR38s. You can also buy this float from Offshore and add that on to your boards, your OR34s. This is actually the OR38. And in turn, this has the awesome Crappie logo on the front and the back of the board, or the packaging. So if you could find this awesome Crappie logo, that's what this board was designed to do. Now, you're going to catch other species on it. Don't let it just be a crappie board. And in fact, it's incredible how, you know, I've caught a tremendous amount of other species on this board. And the good news is that you can use your rods and your reels that you currently have right now. You don't have to go out and buy the big, long trolling rods. You don't have to go out and buy line counter reels. You can basically use your spinning gear with this board to catch more fish. And or you can use this board with the spinning gear that you currently have, and you'll still catch as many fish as just about anybody else. It's a smaller board that was designed to be used with all tackle, all gear, and it's incredible how you can catch fish with it. I talked earlier about different species. I've caught 10 different species in one day. Last year, Mike Baker and I went to Kentucky Lake for a tournament. We caught black crappie, white crappie, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, spotted bass, catfish. I can't name them all, but I'm telling you, there were 10 different species, and it was incredible how many different critters we caught on that board. So you're trolling around, you're catching fish. You can oftentimes slow down. If it's a tight school, let's say I'm trolling by timber. Whenever my planer boards or my flat lines get by timber, I start to catch fish. I'm going to realize that maybe I might be pulling some of those fish off of that timber. It's also a great way to mark brush piles. Not only are you going to hang up in the brush piles while you're trolling, it's not the best way to locate a brush pile, but you know, it works. You're also going to drive over brush piles. You can store them on your graph. What's incredible is as long as it's still on the screen of my Raymarine, I can store that coordinate. I can go back and catch those fish at a later date just by storing a coordinate on that more. Once we find out where those fish are at, though, let's slow down and fish them. So I found some standing pole timber here. And I'm going to fish them. I'm going to dip this timber, or I'm going to jig this timber. Now, often the question that I get asked is, why are you using long rods? And it's really amazing how I'm learning to use 9-foot, 10-foot, 11-foot rods, jigging in cover, jigging in brush piles. I come back up north, and all the northern anglers are just simply shocked that we're using these great big long rods for crappie fishing. And not only for just crappie fishing, but I found that they're coming in handy for catching walleye and a lot of other species up north. One of the reasons that long rods are so effective is that you can reach out and hit more targets. And not just in a boat, but you can also do that shore fishing. If I'm sitting, say right here, the nose of my boat is, say, right on this tree, oftentimes with a long rod, I can reach out and hit every one of these targets with a long rod, just from the boat, just from the bow of the boat. And if you start thinking about how you can walk around the boat and start to hit more targets, it's incredible how many more you can reach out and hit instead of having to nose up the boat and get it right on top of those targets. A long rod gives you the ability to see how much line you've got out. What I've been doing to a lot of my longer rods is I'll take a piece of tape, or I'll take a white permanent marker, and I'll make a mark at every foot from the tip on back to the butt of the rod, so you can know how much line you've got out. Oftentimes I'm fishing with a 10 or 11 foot rod, and I'll have the jig all the way down to the butt of the rod. Let's say with an 11 foot rod, if I've got that jig down to the butt of that rod, well, I know right now that I've got 11 foot of line out. Drop it in the water, unhook it, roll up to a stump, drop it in the water, drop it all the way down to the bottom. I've still got about a foot of line out of the water. When the jig hits the bottom, I know it's 10 foot deep. I don't even have to look at my sonar. So I can move from spot to spot, drop that jig down with 11 foot of line out, just take an eyeball at how much line I got out of the water when the slack appears, meaning the jig's on the bottom, and I could tell how much line I've got out. I can also know where the fish are biting at. If I've got 11 foot of line out and I drop that down next to a piece of standing pole timber and say 16 foot of water, and I get bit 10 foot down by that standing pole timber, all I have to do is keep moving around. I might have found out a pattern that all of the good fish or the crappies are biting or relating to 10 foot down over 16 foot of water. So again, long rods are great for telling how much line you've got out when you're fishing these. You look here, we've got the long rod out here, reaching out, hitting some of these pieces of structure, hitting multiple targets. And then in turn is another reason why long rods work is tuna. You can actually tuna the fish into the boat and in turn get them out of the water without having to get a net. And can you imagine, you reach that rod out and you're fishing this piece of structure right here and you get a fish on. Trying to bring that fish through all of this cover and some of the stuff you can't see that's down there, not a good idea. We've got pretty heavy 10-pound test line, 20-pound test braid on there. We can immediately lift that rod up. It's one steady, slow sweep in action. It's combined actually with the hook set itself. So you can pop that jig into that fish and just keep on lift the fish out of the water and into the boat in one move without even having to bother or get the net. And I've questioned this technique a number of times. I know a lot of people that like to get a net under those fish, but man, that's oftentimes where the fish gets slack and it gets off. So tuning that fish into the boat is going to help you get a lot more fish into the boat, and it's going to come in really handy for you. Another thing I found is that a lot of these guys like to use a longer rod so they can take fish away from their buddy. And what I mean by that is when you're fishing timber, oftentimes the first one to get their jig in there is going to be the first guy to catch the fish. Now let's keep in mind that if we drop that jig on enough targets and we keep moving and grooving and put our jig in front of more fish and more active fish, we're going to catch more fish. So in turn, as you're going to reach up and you're going to drop that jig down, jigging around a little bit, pick it up, move it to another target, especially if you've determined what the pattern is and what the depth is. You know, maybe if you get pecked, you might want to stay there a little bit longer, but if you don't get pecked, boom, you're off to the next target, so on and so forth. When I say taking fish away from your buddy, oftentimes the guy in the front of the boat's got a 10-foot rod. I'm standing 2 foot behind him. I got a 10-foot rod. He's going to get to all that cover first. So you know what? Maybe I might want to bring a 12-foot rod the next time I'm fishing with a buddy of mine that's got a 10-foot rod. More often than not, what we do is we stand side by side. We take turns. But if you're in the back of the boat and you're getting rear-ended, so to speak, fish the stuff you can't see. Fish, just start dragging your jig around. And what's interesting about this is that in dragging your jig around, dragging it from one piece of structure to the next, you're going to find structure underneath the water, brush piles underneath the water that you didn't know existed. So it's a wonderful way to present that jig and put that jig in front of a fish and find a piece of structure that you didn't know existed. And oftentimes one of my best presentations when I'm jigging is to take my rod tip when it's next to a piece of timber and my jig is next to that piece of timber, and then I'll just slowly drag the rod away from the timber, and that will pendulum that jig and swim that jig away from that piece of timber. And that oftentimes is a way to trigger strikes. So longer rods help you do that, allow you to swim that jig farther, and allow you to catch more fish. Now, rods to use. I prefer St. Croix rods. I buy them, of course, but I really have fell in love with these panfish series that they've got. They've got 9-footers, 10-footers, 11-footers. They seem very, very, very light compared to a lot of the long rods that the southern anglers fish with. I found them to be deadly sensitive. And you know what? I found that I can tuna a fish out of that deeper water with these rods. Another thing I like about them is that the reel is farther forward on these rods, so I can actually balance that rod against my arm and forearm, and in turn, I get less fatigue fishing these long rods. You fish a long rod all day and you haven't done a lot of it, you might not make it all day. It'll wipe you out. But with these longer rod handles, rested against your forearm, rested against your elbow, they really take out a lot of the fatigue and really help out a lot. And again, being ultra sensitive, oftentimes I'm going to feel bites that other anglers aren't going to feel, and in turn I'm going to be able to catch more fish. Another thing is that a peck, a light tap, feeling that fish bite might make you slow down and fish that timber a little bit longer. It'll give you that whereabouts of that fish, or give up the fact that that fish is there. And in turn is, instead of hop, skipping, and jumping and blazing away from that fish, I might slow down and try to change colors, change jig sizes, change my cadences, figure out a way to trigger that fish. Or that tap might tell me that fish is there. I'll mark a waypoint on that stump or stub or spot, leave it alone for a while, come back later. And it's amazing how that difference in time will actually bring you back to a spot, and that fish will be turned on an hour later, half an hour later, 2 hours later, whatever the case may be. So let's keep moving, and I'm going to jump through a couple of tricks and tips on how to catch more crappie, or a couple more techniques as well. One is to float your way to more crappie. It's amazing how over the years my ego, for some reason or other, I just haven't fished slip floats or floats as much as I should. Here's a good buddy of mine, Matt Straw from In-Fisherman. He's a big time outdoor writer. He writes for a lot of different publications now. He's not just with In-Fisherman, but Matt continually amazes me how he goes back and finds a program with floats when nothing else fished. We fish together a lot. And here I'm casting, I'm fishing, the mountain man routine I call it, with trying to avoid fishing with a float. Straw man will put on a float, and all of a sudden he'll start to kick my tail fishing with that float. Now, I brought up the term macho, ego. You know, I think sometimes we think of fishing with floats or bobbers as a way to fish like when you were a kid, and we get away from it, and our ego maybe won't allow us to put on a float. It also is another thing to add to the line, so it takes up some time. But man, I tell you, if I'm catching fish, sometimes, most of the time, in fact, all of the time, I really don't care about my ego. I care about catching fish. Now let's talk about the difference between floats and bobbers. And this might be one of the things that contributed to that ego thing, is that we all remember these red and white bobbers. This over here on this side is a float. Showed you earlier, this thing that Matt's got on here is a float. These are floats. These are bobbers. Bobbers sit there and they just kind of bob around. If you get a crappie on, even with this small bobber here, and it can't take that thing under easily, oftentimes it's going to drop it. Fish feel that bobber and they spit it out. They're not into that. They're not into that. It feels differently. When you've properly got a float and you've got that weighted on the line, that crappie's not going to feel that float. It's going to take that bait. It's going to be more natural for it. And in turn is, you're going to get a lot more fish in the boat. You're going to get about the same amount of bites oftentimes. But because you've got that float on there and it's not bobbing around or that fish isn't going to feel it, you're going to catch a lot more fish. Here's one of my favorite presentations. The guy that taught me how to fish, Randy Cooter Coleman. This was a farm pond trick that we did years ago. He taught me how to do this. And it just basically, what was interesting is back then we used the little teeniest bobbers that we could find, and we'd spray paint them black. Oftentimes when it was a really hot bite, it didn't matter if it was white side down, red side down. But we use those little floats or little bobbers. We'd use about a 2-foot chunk of line between the bobber and the jig. And then we'd use a really small hand-tied hackle pheasant feather combination. Here's another one I like to use. This one, my buddy Kyle Steinfeld showed me this pattern and tied this up. But, you know, whatever light jig, even ice jigs, a small float, a small jig, you don't even have to use live bait. But if you want to put a piece of power bait on here, a small piece of plastic, an artificial, a wax worm, a maggot, this presentation is deadly. Basically how you fish this, either from a boat or from shore, you can dip it along individual pieces of cover. You can toss it under docks, dip it under docks. You can cast it out and reel it really slow. That's how I got started with this presentation. We'd walk along the farm pond, just walk all the way around that pond and start fan casting this bad boy out. Cover the water where you're fan casting, move on down the line and keep moving and grooving. And pretty much it's all offense. As soon as you feel a fish or you see that float jump or twitch, you just start reeling real slow. One thing I found out is if you set the hook or you jerk too hard, you're going to yank it right out of a crappie's mouth. You catch a lot of bluegill while you're doing this, bass. And I'm not prejudiced. Oftentimes, I don't care what's tugging on the other end of my line. If I can catch more fish, I'm happy. I've even used this presentation to win tournaments. Fished a multi-species tournament years ago. We were using this for crappies and bluegills, trying to get those. It was eight different species. The first biggest bass, 3 out of the 4 days, or 2 smallmouth, 2 largemouth. So we caught the biggest largemouth or smallmouth, 3 out of the 4 categories. And then in turn it opened up my eyes that, man, what a great way to catch bass. I'm going to let that eagle thing come back into play here. I tell a lot of my bass buddies this trick, or I've got a buddy of mine fishing the Mississippi River, calls me up. He says, man, I got a bass tournament. I tell him about this tactic. There is no way in heck I can convince any of my bass tournament buddies in order to fish this presentation. So you know what? If you fish bass tournaments, don't be afraid. And this is a technique that's called the float and fly. It's been used by bass guys for years, maybe a little bit bigger presentations, but it's incredible. Well, sometimes those big fish don't want that great big bait. They want that small bait. Moving right along, Slip floats and spring floats. Now there's a difference. Here's a spring float. Here's a slip float over here on the right. In between is a combo spring and slip. This was a crappie bobber that Phil came out with. Todd Huckabee and Barry Moreau helped him devise this presentation or this product. And I don't know if it's still out there, but man, what a great idea to where you've already got the knot on the line. You've got a bobber that can also be converted to a spring float if you need to. Pretty simple formulation though when it comes to spring floats or slip floats. Oftentimes I'm going to use a spring float when the water is 4 foot or under. Now a 4 foot chunk of line between your jig, your split shot, and a spring float is quite a bit to cast. You can fling it out there. You get any farther than that, any more than that, man, it's especially when you've got split shot involved in between your jig or your hook and your float, and that stuff can tangle up pretty easily. So you get over 4 foot, that's when you're going to want to switch to a slip float. Slip floats are outsold by spring floats. In other words, spring floats actually outsell slip floats 10-1. And this right here is probably the reason. With a slip float, you've got to put a bead on here and a stop knot. First, you put your stop knot on the line. Then you put a bead. That stop knot, you set that at different depths. And then in turn, as that floats your presentation at that different depth. So if you've got 10 foot of line from your presentation to that stop knot, that's oftentimes where that slip bobber is going to stop. Don't catch any fish, raise it up a little bit, keep moving that knot around. As soon as you find the hot depth, pretty easy to get back to that hot depth. But in turn, as you've got to put that knot on there, you've got to put that bead on there, you put your float on there, then you put your sinker on there. I oftentimes will use a sinker, a slip sinker, and a swivel where this slip sinker will stop on top of that swivel. Then you put about 12 to 20 inches of line out there, and then you put your presentation on. When you go to cast this, though, all of this goes down to that 20 inches maximum. Add another 3 or 4 inches. All you've got to do is cast about a 24-inch chunk of whatever out to that fish. Here's another way to do it. Instead of using a slip sinker and a swivel, you just put lead shot on there. And this is more typically how this presentation is used. But in turn is, these sinkers should be just enough weight to float that bobber at one of these lines right here. This line right here, or you see this between the chartreuse and orange. You want to balance that float or put those weight on there to balance that float right at that line while you're fishing. And the reason you want to do that is that let's say that we're going to take this bobber right here, this float. I still get in the habit of calling these things bobbers. And we're going to float this so that the water line is right at that orange line right there. Mr. Crappie comes up, grabs a hold of this hook, and lifts up. And more often than not, a crappie bite is what we call a lift bite. Well, in turn is when that crappie lifts up on that bite, it lifts that float up, and in turn, once that float is lifted up, viola, time to set the hook, time to reel it in, time to catch a fish on a lift bite. If you've got a red and white bobber on there, or if you don't have this float properly balanced, you're never going to see that lift bite. The other thing that's going to happen is a lot of times on good quality floats, those water lines, or even this water line right here, and that really takes a lot of tweaking to get that float to float right there. I oftentimes will just start here at these water lines. If I've got really finicky fish that keep dropping it when they feel the float, then I might try to weight it up higher up here or balance that float to where my water line is going to come right there to where if that fish just barely touches that, it's going to pull that a remainder of that float underneath the water. That will determine, or that will show you that bite a lot easier. But in any event, the water line will show you a pull down, or a lift bite, and will spook a lot less fish. Now that's a bobber. Just remember, there's a difference between bobbers and floats. Turn your sonar off. And you might be asking me, what are you talking about? Turn your sonar off. Turn that sonar off. It's amazing the stuff you can see while you're looking at a sonar. It's amazing sometimes how distracted you might get by looking at the sonar all the time. When we figure out a pattern, when we've got our waypoints, our trolling paths, we already know that they're in the stumps and they're 10 foot down. More often than not, we'll shut our sonar off. This is something that I've been taught by a lot of the tournament anglers on the Crappie Masters that are really, really experienced. When they're fishing, especially off the front of the boat, they feel that sonar spooks fish. I've seen it happen in other species. I've seen it happen back when I was younger with crappies. My buddy Cooter that I was talking about earlier, he almost insisted on not ice fishing with a flasher or with a sonar unit. He felt they spooked fish. So you know what? Sometimes it might be superstition. Sometimes it might be fact. But if we've located those fish, we figured out that pattern, we're going to turn that sonar off. I've got my settings on my sonar to where I can go onto my unit and switch from my chart fish combo, and I'll switch to just a regular chart, shut off my sonar, and boom, I'll just plot it out. And it doesn't show it here, but if I were to have a screenshot ready with, say, coordinates bang, 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 I don't even need my sonar to stay on those coordinates. I can just stay on that line and go from coordinate to coordinate without using my sonar. Just simply use my plotter and just plot it out. Now, don't be embarrassed if you're gassy. Keep rolling right along with another tip here. Got a lot of people talking about not spooking fish with electronics. Not spooking fish. If you've got an electric motor, you can sneak up on those fish. More often than not, a lot of people can't run their electric trolling motor in the bow of the boat without having it on high fry and that voo, voo, voo. If you're going to use electric, constant on is the way to go. But in a constant trolling pattern, what we found with walleyes, and now I'm starting to find out with crappies, is that trolling with a gas motor actually can allow you to catch more fish when the fish are spooky. They just don't seem to be as spooked by this motor, and I can't explain why. I can't tell you if it's because gas motors been around longer than electric motors. I can't tell you that electric motors spook fish, but I can tell you this. It seems that sometimes that gas motor, we can run our boards closer to the boat. And in turn is, if you need to slow down, you can put out 5-gallon buckets. You can drag chains. You can use a drift sock. I use my power pole a lot of times. Now I've got a drift paddle that goes onto that power pole. Put that down in the water, and in turn that can slow you down, especially when you really need to knock this gas motor down to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tenths of a mile an hour. Different methods are going to slow down that boat and allow you to use that gas motor. Here's a shot of the drift paddle. Speed's crucial, man, when you're trolling. And if I can just put that in the water, regardless if it's an electric motor or a gas motor, a drift paddle, other ways to slow down your speed. Let's say you're using the gas motor, you could put the bow mount trolling motor in the water, and that'll slow you down. If you're trolling with a wind from behind, that wind from behind will actually allow you, when you close that windshield, that'll actually pick up your speed. So there's ways to speed up and slow down. Adjusting your speed, again, is a crucial way to catch more fish. If it's part of the pattern, which it usually is, use those items to slow or adjust your speed, and you're gonna find that you're gonna catch a lot more fish. Keep on moving. It never ceases to amaze me how anglers go out, sit on a brush pile, get into a tree row, get out into an open water trolling spot, fishing slows down, and they just grind it out without moving. We hear it all the time. both recreational anglers or tournament anglers at the weigh-ins. Man, I wasn't catching any fish. I moved to another spot, didn't catch any fish. Finally, the third, fourth, fifth spot they got to, that's when they found the mother lode. And, just a simple move. And this seems like the stupidest, simplest tip in the world. Sometimes I wonder why I use this tip, but I'm going to tell you why. Because sometimes I forget to keep on moving. So you just keep on moving, keep on grooving, and you catch more fish. Go big or go home. It's amazing, especially up north here. The largest jig that most crappie anglers would ever even think about using is an 1/8 ounce jig. I like using a lot of 1/4 ounce jigs. I've learned this from Todd Huckabee, to where I don't think he's got a jig smaller than 1/8 ounce in his boat most of the time. What's amazing about big jigs, 1/8 ounce, 3/16, 1/4, even 3/8, is that fish, they seem to get much more violently hit. They seem to attract more fish, and it's a great way to catch more fish. Now, there's a multitude of reasons to use a big jig. One is it helps you to drop out of the wood. As you notice there, I showed you these jigs here. These teardrop jigs are one of the ones I use in timber a lot. I know a lot of people insist on using snagless jigs or weedless jigs. I like using these so I can drop out of the wood. And what I mean by that, you're jigging around wood for crappie. And it's amazing how the slower you move that jig or the more still you hold it, the more fish you catch. I'm cautious when I'm fishing in timber. I don't want to hang up my jig. I don't want to stick that jig in that wood so hard I can't get it out. So when I'm lifting and dropping it, I'll feel that branch. I'll feel my line sliding over that. I'll lift it up, bang. I'll hit it with the jig head. Hold it there just for a little bit, slowly drop it back down, bam, that's when you get hit. Or you lift it up, bang, 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 and then sooner or later it pops over that limb, and bam, that's when you get hit. Oftentimes, you're lifting up, bang, 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 trying to lift it over that stick. Can't swim it out, can't swim it away, and then it gets hung up. A heavy jig head allows you to pendulum. You just shake that jig up and down or side to side, and you can actually drop it out of the wood. Muddy water, big jigs attract big fish. I think the fish also allows a fish to find that jig in muddy water. I've seen it before to where we're fishing 16th ounce or 32nd ounce jigs for crappies, dirty water, even in clear water. You can't get bit. You step up to a 1/4 ounce, 3/8 ounce jig. All of a sudden, bang, 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 bang. Same color, same tail, same everything. That heavier jig, those fish can locate it. They can also locate it with bigger tails or heavier tails. So don't be afraid to mix that up. And when we start talking about big jigs, also big jigs have big hooks. And with the size of a mouth that a crappie's got, it's invaluable to have a big hook on there. Add on some vibration or some flash, like with these road runners or these awesome walleye runners, as they're called. You know what? Crappies aren't prejudiced. These are awesome for crappie too. And they come in 1/4 and 3/8 ounce size, which again, to some anglers may seem a little bit big. This 2-aught hook may seem a little bit big, but I'm going to tell you what, crappies love these too. And that extra flash or that extra shake or that extra attraction from that blade oftentimes will be a game changer when you're crappie fishing. We talked earlier about plastics. You know what? Different bodies will throw off different sound. I oftentimes, even if I'm fishing with, say, certain colors like chartreuse and white, I'll make sure that I have the deck stacked here. I'll have different sizes and shapes. Even how you put the plastic on that jig. If you put this, say this Mo Magic, which is a tremendously deadly crappie plastic, you put that on there, and in turn you put it on flat to the water surface on that jig, or you thread it on sideways. It's amazing how a little bit extra body in the water, one way or the other, is going to actually change the drop rate of that jig. So remembering that different weighted jigs have a different drop rate. Now that might be time to go smaller if you want that jig to drop slower as you get it down to that fish that's in that brush pile or that timber or near the bottom. Or oftentimes what you can do is you can put a bigger jig on there and you could drop down to the fish faster. So that's up for you to determine. Do I go big? Do I go small? Changing that drop weight, attracting more fish, experiment, and you're going to catch more fish. This is one of the reasons that we make a lot of our own tackle. Use a tremendous amount of do-it jigs so that I can make the head that I want to make. The body style, or head style, is so to speak. You got here is a teardrop, right here with this guy right here. Over here's a bat jig. This is a really, really snagless jig. When you're dropping that down and cover, it was designed by Corey Batterson with the help of the Do It crew, Jerry Van Sickle. We all came together and helped design this jig so that you've got a smaller hook gap and you can get down into the brush and get back out again a lot of the times without using a weedless jig. Or if I want to use the good old round ball jig, if I want to put a collar on it, if I want to use a wire keeper, customize. And with Do It molds, you can change the hooks as well. We talked about getting your jig back out of timber. Well, using a really light wire hook in that jig versus a really stiff wire hook. Say in another jig, use a light wire jig. You can get that jig out of that cover by bending the hook straight, straighten that hook back with a pair of pliers or putting that hook back where it belonged with a pair of needle nose, and boom, you're back in business without taking all that time to retie. So you can customize your jigs. And I travel with a lot of jigs without paint on them so that when I get on the road, I can find a hot color. I don't have to carry 10 gazillion jigs with me. In fact, right now as we speak, my crappie partner, Mike Baker, if he's not watching this, which he's probably not, he's going to get enough of me in the tournaments to come. He's probably at home pouring up jigs and putting them in a tackle box, plain lead heads. We catch a lot on plain lead heads, but we're making a bunch of jigs right now for this next tournament stint because we need certain jigs. We also want to paint them on the road. We carry our powder paint and a torch with us or a Bic lighter even, and boom, you can customize them on the road. Speaking of customizing, making a lot of bodies on our own now. We're shooting our own plastics with Do It molds. And they've even got Essential Series molds, which are not going to break the bank like a really expensive production mold. With some of these newer inexpensive molds, you can get a mold for well under $100 or well under, say, $60 and start making your own shapes and kicking out a bunch of different colors, bunch of different shapes. Do it yourself. It's a lot of fun, and it's also very effective to customize and make the stuff that you need to make. Like I like to say, been there, do that. Here was a situation where we were going on a Midwest Outdoors photo shoot, found out that the fish were biting on these colors right here. This was actually the box that we made up for that shoot. They were biting on orange and white, chartreuse and white. So what did me and Kyle do? Right here, we shot a bunch of plastics in those colors, went out the next day to film the photo shoot and also the television show, and shazam, we were all ready to go. We had the colors that we needed, and we caught the fish that we needed. So you know what? Invariably, if you want to catch more fish, a lot of these tricks and tactics can help you do that. Invariably, catch some Crappie Masters action, catch some crappie tackle, let the big ones go, catch a few to eat, but invariably, with these tactics and these tricks, you're going to catch more crappies and have a lot more fun doing it. Folks, thanks a lot for coming. I'm Tommy Skarlis on behalf of Bass Pro Shops and Navionics. I really, really appreciate you coming out. Miles, can you hear me?
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, good job. That was awesome. I actually sat through the whole thing in my fevered condition. Right on. So we've already got a few questions going on here. Do you want to get right into the Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're running a little long.
Yeah, yeah.
As I figured I'd probably run a little bit long, but you know what? everybody got their money's worth, and of course they can always go back on the archives later to catch this if they didn't get to catch it all.
All right, awesome. Well, we've already got 3 questions on here right now. The first one I saw a little bit ago. I thought this was a really good question. It was from Kathleen. Are there going to be any fish left for my grandkids? I feel like all the technology that we're seeing today and all the information is just making so many better fishermen. You know, things like this webinar are really helping people out. I can feel we're taking a lot of fish out of the lakes that I'm fishing. Should we be doing something different to ensure future generations can still enjoy the sport?
That you broke up. Could you ask me that again real quick, Miles?
So essentially what she asks is what can we do to make sure that the fish populations are strong for the future of the sport?
Well, one of the things is, and I put it at the end of the presentation there, and I don't want to. You got to be careful because crappie anglers love to eat fish, and even I love to keep a lot of crappies whenever I'm fishing, and you let the bigger ones go, especially with panfish. Panfish seem to protect their young with their profile. They protect their nests with their profile. In farming, I had a farmer the other day talking about deer hunting. He goes, you wouldn't kill your herd bull, would you? And he was asking me, why we always kill the biggest buck, out in the field. Well, that's easy to answer that question if you're a hunter. But with fish, especially if you're catching a lot of crappies, you don't really need the bigger ones in order to get a meal. So let the big ones go, and that's really going to help our resource. Another thing is clean, drain, dry. We've got an instance where we see that a lot up north here about clean, drain, dry. Cleaning your boat when you're done fishing, draining your boat when you're done fishing, drying out your live wells and your bilge compartments. We actually go to painstaking efforts up here. In fact, there's some areas where up north here, you get caught in Minnesota and a lot of the other states with your drain plug in your boat, and you're going to get a very, very expensive ticket. And I'm talking in the hundreds, if not $200s of dollars for having your plug still in your boat and not draining your bilge. You get home and we bleach our bilges, we bleach our live wells. So that's, stopping the spread of invasives. That's another way to protect the resource. Putting habitat and structure in the lake where legal, which also means supporting your local fishing clubs, supporting your DNR biologists or your state biologists. Our state biologists know a lot about the resource, and those are the ones we need to listen to. So, that's a great way to protect it for future generations to come. And I think the last one, and I haven't named all of them, but the most important is take those future generations fishing. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Take a kid or take a senior fishing, take a vet fishing. But man, if we don't get these kids, boys and girls, into fishing before they're 12, we're probably not going to get them into fishing. And I got a lot of parents coming to me saying, man, I can't get that electronics out of their face. Well, bring the electronics with. Try to keep it from going in the drink, unless, of course, if my kids upset me bad enough, I might end up dropping it in the drink. But you get those kids out in the boat, and it's amazing how the electronics they want to start looking at are your sonar units, your mapping units, and teach them how to play those video games instead of the ones that they're going to learn at home or keep their faces on most of the time when they're in their living rooms, bedrooms.
Awesome. One thing I'd like to add on that too, if I may, Kathleen, one thing that I noticed is a lot of people, you've got to follow the local and state regulations when it comes to the fish. They know what they're doing. They set those regulations and limits for a reason. And one thing I think is that we all try to reach that maximum limit. And maybe if you teach the youth to just take what they need up until that maximum limit, that can kind of help, the situation too, instead of taking more than you need. Sometimes it doesn't take a full limit to fill the dinner table. The next question that we've got is from Kevin, and he asks, do you have to use the planer board with the tadpole?
Oh, we use the planer boards a lot. In fact, that I covered it pretty quick, so he might not have seen it. But that slide that I showed there earlier, can you see these slides, Miles?
Yep.
It actually shows that planer board in conjunction with the tadpole. Here it is right here. And so you've got the planer board right here. It's running the line down to the tadpole. And, here's what's interesting about this presentation, or where this got spawned from, or this idea. We're down in Florida, and these guys troll, they flatline jigs for crappies. And they're putting out 150 to 200 foot of line and 8 presentations. And I looked at my partner, Kyle, and I'm like, man, there's got to be a better way to do this. And come to find out, they've got their rod tips way high in the air. They've got 200 foot of line out. You look down the line and there's only 20 foot of line in the water. So you could put those two 16th ounce jigs or those two 32nd ounce jigs or whatever, 20 foot behind a planer board and run it out beside the boat, and shazam, you're down there. Or let's say you want to get a couple of flies down and you don't want to use all that line. Put out 6 foot of line to a tadpole, 7 foot of line, 8 foot of line to a tadpole, and you go 1 mile an hour, and you're dropping down that bait 3, 4, 5, 6 foot deep, and you don't have to run 150 to 200 foot of line out. Plus the planer boards take the presentation out beside the boat. That's the other reason why they're running all this line. They're doing S-turns. They're trying to make the jigs drag over the water that the boat didn't go over. So with a planer board, you put that out in the water, you control in a straight line. You don't necessarily have to make turns. And the one thing that turns do, if you stall the inside too hard, your presentations drop down to the bottom. They could get snagged. They could get fouled up. There's a lot of things that could go wrong with dropping those presentations too much. A little bit of drop is good. Raising those baits up and down in the water column sometimes will trigger strikes. But definitely you can attach a planer board to the line when you're using a tadpole.
All right, excellent. The next question is from Lamont. What temperature do you find crappie to bite best? How many consecutive days should we look for that temperature before we know it's go time?
The only thing I've seen temperature, with in relationship to that question, it's a great question, but don't get hung up on the temperature. And what I mean by that is, you might want to pay attention to the temperature, keep a journal. It's one mistake I've made. But you could say, okay, when the water was from this temperature, say 60 degrees to 70 degrees, these crankbaits work the best. When it was 70 to 80 degrees, these crankbaits work the best. And what you'll find out is, like a bandit has a big side-to-side wobble. A flicker shad or a shad wrap has a tighter wobble. So flicker shads or shad wraps make work best in cold front conditions or spooky fish conditions or negative neutral fish conditions, where the bandits may work in that warmer water because they're more radical. You talk about temperature. When should I pay attention to temperature and then go fishing? Anytime, any temperature is a good time to go fishing. Again, just one thing to remember is, man, if the water temperature's dropped or dropping, the fish might move a little deeper, or they might slow down a little bit. If that water temperature is raising or the water's coming up, those fish may move shallower, or they may come closer to the surface. So that's where I pay attention why I pay attention to temperature, are those reasons.
Excellent. All right. one is from Barry. We've got 3 more as of right now. The lake I fish in Arkansas is very, very deep and clear. Do these same principles apply?
Really deep and clear water, you know, you want to get maybe the baits farther away from the boat. You might want to, you know, slow down and get the bait, lift the baits a little higher from the fish. The one thing we found with clear water is that fish will come up a lot farther to hit a bait, or they'll travel a lot farther to hit a bait. And that's because they can see the bait. So getting your presentations higher above those fish, but slowing down, because you're going to have to give that crappie an opportunity to rise up to bite that bait. One thing you'll find out, though, about rising crappies, the farther you can get them to come up, the more committed they're going to be. And we found this in ice fishing. We fish crystal clear waters ice fishing. Same thing applies to ice fishing as it does in open water. You might have to downsize your baits. You might have to use more natural colors. But we can get those fish to come a longer distance because they can probably see the bait. Then we also have to slow down a little bit so that that fish has time to rise on that bait and react.
All right, excellent. This one comes from Mike. What is the best electronic technology to locate crappie? Side imaging or down imaging sonar?
Well, with what I use Ray Marine, and then the term's a little bit different. Excuse me if the terminology, my terminology is different, but Ray Marine calls it down vision, side vision. You know, I use the different looks, I'll call them on my units, my sonar units. I use the different looks of side vision, down vision, 3D vision, plain 2D sonar, chirp sonar. I use different looks for different situations. I use them like a golfer would use golf clubs. So, you know, it's kind of a loaded question, man. But if I'm going along trying to locate fish underneath docks, I'm going to use side vision. If I'm going and trying to locate fish down in the brush, I'm going to be able to separate targets with down vision a little bit better. The new 3D vision that we've got with Ray Marine, it's incredible that we can actually build our structure just like we build a map with SonarChart live or SonarChart. I can actually build a 3D piece of structure on my sonar now with that unit. So that might be one of the reasons I use 3D vision. Or if I want to see the crappie and see the bait in a 3D appeal after I've traveled over it and I've done this, I can look at that and I can look at it from all angles. If I want to spot fish when I'm cruising and I've got my transducer set up on my Ranger so I can go 40 miles an hour, then I'm going to use a 2D sonar, shoot through the hole so that I can mark fish at 40 miles an hour. If I'm trying to mark fish, and you know, it's what you prefer sometimes, but there are some ways to use the different looks in order to look at those fish differently. And I hope I answered that question effectively, but man, that's a tough question to answer. Sometimes I'm in the boat and I look at all of them. I use all of them to look at the fish or the structure.
Yeah, a lot of different technology. You use it for different stuff for sure. I think that was good. All right. David asks, do your tips change for ice fishing? Do you work the lake in a similar way?
Oh, absolutely. When you're breaking down patterns, you know, what I shared, you know, is I don't know, I'll roll you back and a coast through time. When I first started competitive fishing, I was on Navionics Pro staff since 2000s, if not the late 90s. excuse me, I can't remember when I started, but I started a long time ago. And it was amazing how I went out and used my map to find structure. In other words, the structure was on the map, and then in turn is I would figure out a pattern, and I would use that map to find and exploit that pattern. Everybody's caught up now. Back then, we had the best mapping. There weren't a lot of guys that were using it. There weren't a lot of guys that even had the old, I can't remember what the name of it was, but it was what we used before GPS. And in turn is, everybody's caught up now because of mapping, but you still need to put the pattern together. So using those different keys to that pattern, speed, location, presentation, etc., putting everything together, I use in walleye fishing. I use that now in crappie fishing. If I went out catfishing, I'd use it. I use it for ice fishing, saltwater fishing. It's incredible how those are the pieces of the puzzle, and putting those together helps you put that puzzle together.
All right. David asks when to use live bait versus plastics.
Well, I started out using live bait, and if I'm marking fish or I know fish are there, did I say artificial? I start out using artificial bait, and if I'm marking fish or I know they're there, I'll switch to live bait if I'm not catching them on artificial bait. And it's amazing how a lot of the tournaments that I've done well in, both walleye fishing and crappie fishing, all I've needed was artificial bait. Now, sometimes, man, it's hard to beat the flash or the smell of a real live minnow, or that's what we call them as Yankees up here down south. They call them minners. So my recommendation is going to be, experiment with that. Now, we showed slip floats earlier. Slip floats, you're dangling a bait. Sometimes, man, it's hard to beat a live bait offering, especially the slower you're moving it. You're letting that bait work for you. I always say, though, it's a lot tougher to catch them on artificials. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's easier to catch them on artificials. But there's other ways that artificials make it easy. And I know that was kind of a roundabout way to answer that question, and probably not a very good one. But I guess if I got to give you one answer to that question, you've got to be the one to experiment with artificial over live bait and let the fish tell you what they want.
I thought that was good. All right. The next one is, how do you decide what speed to pull crankbaits or slow troll minnows or jigs while spider rigging? What water temp, time of year, etc.?
Well, again, the colder the water, sometimes the slower you have to go. Spider rigging, slow trolling, spider rig presentations, we'll stop the boat if we catch a good fish. That's when it's time to power pull down and just let your baits work, let your jigs work, let your lures work. And it's amazing how one fish will tell you where there's a bunch of other fish. But with speed, determining the right speed, the best thing I can tell you is drive like a drunken sailor. Speed up, slow down, vary your speeds. An experimenting troller and a busy troller is a successful troller. But if you just sit there and get hung up on one speed or one bait, you're not going to catch as many fish. So what I usually do is I'll start at trolling crankbaits 1 mile an hour, and I'll speed up or slow down from there. With tight line trolling, I'll usually start out at about 0.7, and we'll speed up or slow down from there. It oftentimes, again, is all based on experimentation. And you know what, I'll say, well, if it gets cold or a cold front rolls through, you might want to slow down. If the fish are neutral or negative, you might want to slow down. Sometimes it's the exact opposite. Cold front comes through, the fish are negative or neutral, and you speed up and you trigger fish. And that's what we found out in the Crappie Masters Championship in 2013. there was a lot of anglers spider rigging 0.3 of a mile to 0.6 of a mile an hour in the tournament, that the last day they sped up just because they weren't getting bit, and they triggered strikes, and they almost caught us. So, you're going to want to experiment a little bit and let the fish tell you what they want for speed.
All right, another great answer. Adam asks, and we've got 3 on the board right now, 3 more questions. We can go whenever you like, but they should be short questions. Adam asks, do you have a naming pattern for your waypoints? So, in other words, do you have a pattern for naming your waypoints through color, date, or symbol to remember your best spots? Kind of a cool question.
Yeah, it is a great question. In fact, Adam, you're starting to get out some of my deep secrets now. I'm just kidding. We'll answer these 3 questions, Miles, and then we'll call it quits. I'm getting pretty wiped out, and you with the flu. It sounds like a good place to get off here. But with marking those coordinates, what I oftentimes will do is I'll put maybe brush pile 1, brush pile 2, or if I'm trolling, I'll use a code like I'll use B for the letter, which means bandit, 2, which means 200, M, which means mistake for the color. And then, you just put together your little code for each one of those coordinates. Especially the older I get, I have a terrible memory. So absolutely, take the time on your coordinates to make a code for them. And then if you have to reference those coordinates the next time you're on that body of water, or, when you get home, if you want to make notes, you can go back to them. And, if there's one mistake I've made, it's, again, I haven't kept that good of a journal over the years. I'm starting to be a little bit better at that. Secondly is, another mistake I've made is I haven't marked my coordinates or coded my coordinates.
All right. That's a cool question. I like that one. This one may be a little bit too nebulous for us to answer right now. It's from Molly. How effective is that pattern just before or just after a lake turns? I think that was in respect to the we're going to skip over that one because I don't know unless you know what she's asking.
Well, go ahead and ask the whole question, and I'll take a stab at it.
Okay, so the whole question is, how effective is that pattern just before or just after a lake turns?
Before the lake turns, any pattern can be an effective one. After the lake turns, your guess is as good as mine, but the funny thing about turnover is that pattern can be, I'm assuming the trolling pattern is what we're talking about here. The trolling pattern can be deadly effective after a turnover because you're putting the baits in front of more fish. So, oftentimes what we do is we figure out ways to talk us out of fishing, or we figure out ways to go in early or quit after a slow day. Turnover is one of them. You know what? You just got to go out there and see what they're biting on. Keep trying different things. And if that pattern isn't working before or after turnover, try another one. But don't be afraid to try that pattern because of anything.
There we go. My audio's back on. That was a good answer to that. All right, so the last one that we're going to answer is from Dorian here. What would you say is your key to boat control?
If I had to say one thing right now, well, let's say 2 things that are the key to my boat control. It's number 1, having the right power source and knowing how to use it. Been using trolling motors. I use a Minn Kota Ulterra, or actually an Ultrex. Before that, we were using a the one that actually goes by autopilot. Anything with an autopilot on it is really going to help your trolling and allow you to catch more fish. And, with that trolling motor, I don't care if it's, the Minn Kota iPilot, or if it's, say like Motor Guide's got a great one out now to allow you to follow the contour, allow you to follow a trolling pass, allow you to use a different steering devices to steer that motor. That helps out. The one thing that's really been truly blowing my mind right now for boat control is using that drift paddle on my power pole, or in some instances, just using the power pole to speed me up and slow me down. And, I get asked a lot of questions because I've got one on my walleye boat, two on my crappie. They're always like, oh yeah, you've got that one on your walleye boat. Really, how much can that help? I'm finding out now that I'm just using my great big Evinrude Gen 2 E-Tech, the big motor, the 250, in conjunction with that drift paddle to pull lead core and troll crankbaits and other presentations at 1 mile or above with my big motor. And then therefore I don't have to stick anything in the water to troll other than the drift paddle. I'm trolling with my big motor. Boat control, sometimes if you don't have any boat control too, that can help you. But man, again, something with autopilot on it for a trolling motor, or knowing how to run your kicker motor, your trolling motors is a very important asset to your, or facet to your trolling. And then another thing again is using that power pole, the drift paddle, made a big difference for me.
All right, great. Good job, Tommy. All great questions, all great answers. Right now, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. We still have questions on the board there, but you know what? I actually want to let those people reach out to you personally. So how can people follow you on social media and your website and all that?
Miles, if anybody wants to find me or ask me a question, I try to get to all the questions. Give me a little time. Sometimes it takes me a while to answer comments on in fact, right now I know I've got a bunch of them sitting on my Facebook page, but they can check out my fan page and go to Facebook, and Skarlis is spelled Skarlis. But find me on Facebook on my fan page. That's one of the best ways to get a hold of me. Or they can go to Navionics Facebook page. They can go to, I've got a website. It's kind of pretty static. I would just basically recommend right now is to track me down through Facebook.
Right there. I'm giving it a like right now. Right there. All right. Awesome. Well, Tommy, this was a great presentation. Really appreciate it. I had a great time. Hope everybody else did too. Thank you guys for showing up for this presentation. This is going to be recorded, so you can come back to it and reference it. Make sure that you go to the Navionics Facebook page, like Tommy just mentioned, and also the website. You can find all of these webinars that we do. I've got one coming up this weekend for the Ned rig for bass fishing. But you can find all of these different presentations, these webinars on that website or on the social media. And so we also want to give a big thanks to Bass Pro Shops. They were the presenting sponsor of this webinar, and of course, Navionics. So thank you very much, Tommy, for your time, and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.